Okay, so now we're recording, and what we're going to do is we're going to go kind of take a little bit of a running start here as to where we left off, and leaving, our early explanation of some of the deities. Deity is a good way to say the different gods. Okay, deity. Let's go ahead and everybody say that with me. Deity. So you have all these deities, minor ones, major ones, millions of them really. India is a really complex, wonderful, beautiful place, but in its history, about 3,000 years ago, when the invasion, the Indo-European Aryan invasion came across, just like it would invade Iran, by the way, the Iranian plateau, basically peoples from the middle of Europe invaded. And when they did, they kind of changed society. And it wasn't as structured back then as it would become later. As you guys learned from that little video, this caste system got more and more detailed and in many ways more oppressive as time went on. So, but we need to know the basic groups. And the original groups were what you see here. Now I've got a better chart, I think. If we look at this, we've got the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, the Shudras, and I always struggle to say those properly. Don't hesitate to just say it as best you can, because let's be honest, none of us speak Hindi, so we're not going to be able to say them 100% anyway. So that's okay though, because if you see it and you can kind of say it, I think that's good enough. What's more important is that you understand the word and what they mean. The Brahmins class were the priestly class, the academic class. They were the ones that were guardian, basically the theology of Hinduism, right? They were the brains, if you will, of the society, the culture setters. The political rulers, though, came from the next class, the Kshatriya class. Now, these guys were the rulers, administrators, the warriors, and they kind of worked in combination with the Brahmins. So the Brahmins were the religious kind of thing, kind of put them at the top, and the most educated. And then you have the leaders who are also very well educated, whatever, but they're also the people running the show. Now, as you see with this god here on the side, this is the creator god. What's the name of the creator god? Do you remember from the movie? Brahma, yeah. And so from Brahma, you have the head, the thinkers, the Brahmins, the shoulders and the arms, the warriors, the leaders, the strong folks. Then you have the people in the middle, in the core, we call it, right? Who are the ones who are the artisans, the craftsmen, the traders, the merchants, the people basically that manage the economy, if you will. And they can be very wealthy. And then you have the Shudras, who are the manual laborers. And it's like you create this caste system in order to keep people working at certain types of jobs. So if there was a certain type of job that was all of a sudden important, then you would create a caste for it, a subclass. So by the time we get to 1950, and this system's been in place for 3,000 to 4,000 years, we have 25,000 separate castes. And your family's known by your caste. Even your last name could be based on your caste. And then in relatively modern times, not in ancient times, not in medieval times, not in classical times, but in modern times, they added the people doing the really tough jobs. We call those essential workers today. But those who work with sanitation, I mean, look, you guys, haven't you ever seen roadkill here in Utah, right? See a dead deer on the highway? Who do you think picks that up? Somebody has that job to go clean that up. You can't leave it there, right? It's going to cause flies and all sorts of other diseases and whatever else. And then you get lots of birds and things come and try to eat it and all that kind of stuff. And anyway, it's a disaster. So they have to be, somebody's got to do that job. And by the way, the most important jobs in our society are really sanitation workers, because when we get good sanitation in a city, it immediately extends people's life expectancies. You know that, right? I mean, if you don't have a sewer running down the middle of your street giving you cholera, that's a good thing. And so learning how to deal with all of this was important. And in India, they had to do this. And so a whole group of people, that's their lot in life. Now, people tend to accept this a little bit more there because of the fact that it's a wheel of lives. In other words, when this life ends, you go to another one. And so the idea is over time, centuries, whatever, how long, you can change where you are. So it's a very different mentality based around the idea of reincarnation, right? Which is, kind of, again, unique to India and its revolution. I want to play this little video here because this is one where one of the most important jobs in India is from this untouchable class, the Dalits, right? It's burial of people. Now, here's the thing. Putting somebody to rest, to final rest, is a sacred act. In India, it would be through cremation. But only a certain caste is allowed to do that. And that caste, that's their job. That's their mission, if you will, in life. But at the same token, they're looked down upon in a sense because they're part of this corrupted class, this impure class, because they have to deal with dead bodies. Brahmin wouldn't do that. Kshatriya wouldn't do that. Yasha wouldn't do that. Even a Shudra would have a hesitancy. Remember that one guy saying, hey, I shook a hand with somebody here, a Dalit. I shook their hand and I had to go home and take a shower. What? I mean, come on, man. What is that all about? Now, these discrimination based on jobs was ended in India in 1950. And I need you to know that year. In what year was the caste system basically said it's illegal to discriminate somebody on jobs because of their class, because of what they were born in. They made shoes like that one guy, if you saw in the video, remember the painter, the guy that was the painter? They've been doing that for 6-7 generations and they kind of like it. It feeds the family well. It's fun. It's interesting work. So you can keep that. But that doesn't mean you're stuck there anymore, especially if you go into the cities. And they have very competitive schools, right, that now allow people a chance at what we call, keyword here, social mobility. In the worst form of this system, the caste system, there's no social mobility. You're not going to be Shudra and become a Brahmin all of a sudden. That the whole system is set up to prevent that kind of thing from happening. But in modern times, we've even had a Dalit, somebody from this lower class, this untouchable class, become prime minister of the country, leader of the country. So anyway, things are changing in India, but here's one job that will never change. Somebody has got to lay, well, it's like mortuary directors, people that run a mortuary here in the United States, and we have funerals all the time, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and play this link. And this is one job that was given to this caste. Okay, it's really short.
My journey led me first down the plain of the river Ganges. Here in the 5th century BC, a series of kingdoms grew up with cities. And in history, cities are always vehicles for change.
The fire, the sacred fire that's been burning for, he said, centuries. And you just can't walk up there and take the fire. It has to go through this caste. So they become essential to what happens next in the afterlife of these people and in the ceremony that would be, somebody's death. Let's go ahead and listen to some more. So he's explaining it really, really well, but you have to listen carefully, okay? So I got a couple people with your heads down. Let's kind of poke our heads up and listen to this guy explaining one of the most important things in all of Indian society and the caste that's been assigned this task. Here we go.
Universe order.
Did you hear what he said? Now that's embers and coals there, right? But that fire has been there for thousands of years. The same fire, sacred fire. Wow. Like this is kind of cool stuff. We have to go back to this ancient time. So let's go ahead and get back to our lecture here. So you see that everybody had a place, and if you did your job properly and lived up to it, then you'd get the benefits of that in your future reincarnation, in your future life. So here we have then subdivided into multiple classes, the caste system. But then there were always rituals. And you just saw one right there. This is the burial ritual. Notice that they would weigh out a certain amount of wood, and they take the sacred fire that's been burning for thousands of years, and they cremate the person and put their ashes into the great sacred river. Okay, all of this has been going on forever and ever and ever. But now you had to have a way, right, for these invaders, the Rajas, to decide what area they ruled over. So they came into an area, right? And they, of course, had the military power, and they were obviously going to be the rulers. But how do you decide what's your little kingdom? What's your little area? And one of the more interesting forms of worship was called the horse sacrifices. Now, there's always sacrifices, you know, in these different religions. For example, you might leave some fruit or something and next to your favorite god and whatever as an offering. So that becomes a big thing. But also, too, it's the horse sacrifice. And so what would happen is you take a horse, right, your favorite horse, and you let it wander. And I don't know how long they let it wander, but it's quite a while. And someone would have to have a bunch of stakes, and wherever that horse went, they'd put a stake in. And the horse went over here, so they put a stake in there. And the horse went over here, so they put a stake in there. And wherever boundary is created by the wandering of that horse becomes your property, your control. That's your area. Then they'd offer the horse up for sacrifice and, you know, do that kind of thing. But by the same token, too, they still do sacrifice. A lot of times it's just milk and butter. Sometimes it's food. The horse sacrifice was old. They don't do that anymore. They wouldn't do that at all. But in the early days, it was one way to define your territory. Let nature decide where the horse goes, and wherever the horse goes is yours to rule over as a Raja or as a chieftain or as the leader. Anyway, kind of an interesting sacrifice. Now, when writing became evident in India, Sanskrit is the form of the written language. When that became there, they started to write down the equivalent of Hindu scripture, which we call Vedic literature. Now, the oldest of these is called the Rig Veda. Okay, these are verses of knowledge. Basically, what it is, it's a little bit like Psalms in the Bible. If you guys have, you know, if you're know that from your religious studies, but they're kind of like Psalms, right? It's 1,000 hymns to the gods, and the hymns to the gods explain a lot of the mythology. So if you read the Rig Veda, you learn about all these different gods, and you learn about what they did and what their roles were. It'd be a little bit like, you know, learning about the Greek gods, Jupiter and all that, and that was Roman god, sorry, Zeus, you know, and so on. And that's where you learn it, is the Rig Veda. It's the mythology of the gods. Now, a little while later, another group of, I guess you could call them scriptures, if you will, called the Yajurveda were produced, written down. And these are the knowledge of rites or rituals, talking about the sacrifices, talking about, you know, how would you cremate somebody? Well, how would you give a proper sacrifice? So that's that. And then there's the Samaveda, which is the knowledge of chants. And you hear a lot of times, you hear people chanting when they were walking around that funeral pyre. You got to know your right chants, what to say at the right moment when you're doing your rituals and so on. And then there's the Atharva Veda, which is the knowledge of the sage Atharva. Now, this is important because this is kind of like when he was extending that people are starting to challenge the old way of thinking for 3,000 years. Well, this is kind of what happens here. They start to challenge a few things. And this great sage, Atharva, basically gives them rituals, spells, and prayers to use. And all of this is a beautiful set of literature. Okay. So anyway, let's drill down on the first one, the Rig Veda. Now, the Rig Veda has 4 parts. The first part are hymns, which are often called mantras. How many have ever done yoga? Anybody done yoga? Do they give you a mantra? They do, right? Which is something you say and whatever. I mean, I've done yoga, I've had my mantras, and I think it helps focus your yoga, practice of yoga. Then the Rig Veda also has these hymns or mantras, and then the rituals that the Brahmins would perform, and only that class at the top. And so this is instruction for sacrifices, whether it be milk or food or whatever it happened to be. Then this one I find very interesting. These are forest treatises. In other words, basically writings about how you live in the forest as an ascetic. And what that means is like being a hermit and living all more remotely in nature, and not being part of a city or a big part of a community, whatever, becoming basically independent of that. And for a lot of people, especially when they get older, this idea of becoming a religious hermit, meditating, contemplating about their lives, whatever, is a very attractive thing. Okay, added later were the Upanishads, and these become expressions of philosophy based upon the previous things that you see there. So in other words, what we're talking about is a very complex study. This is not something that you whip out in a day, and you can't do it in 30 minutes, right? So anyway, but these are the important parts of it. Now I'm just going to give you some examples just because. And so let's go ahead and look at some of these. In this one part of the Rig Veda, basically what we have is there's a story where this one persona, right, is being helped and gets in conflict with one of the gods, Indra. And Indra then destroys this god. The one thing about this storyline is there's a lot of war in it and a lot of violence in it in the mythology. And so that becomes kind of interesting. For example, at Hieropantha, he smote the vanguard of, I can't even say that name, but let's just give it a try, Vivians, and the rear fled frightened. So it's a lot about battles and stuff. I mean, it's a little bit like watching I don't know, like watching an Avengers thing. There's always a battle. There's always something going on. And so it's really, really kind of an interesting kind of set, some of this stuff. Okay, now this is the key part of this, though, is the people they're mentioning here in this passage, right, which is marked by numbers so people can keep track of it, is actually mentioned in a hymn that may go all the way back to that first civilization in Harappa, Mohenjo-daro. So a lot of these stories may have gone back to that very first civilization. That's really the point of this. This is just some data to show you that maybe these stories aren't coming from the Indo-European invasion so much as from that earlier civilization that predated them. So in other words, these stories could be ages old. There's a very famous American named Mark Twain. Do you guys know what Mark Twain wrote? His actual name was Samuel Clemens. What were some of the books he wrote? Yeah. Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn. A lot of those are not, people don't read them anymore. But he was very famous in the 1800s. He did a social commentary basically on life along the Mississippi River with Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer. It was very interesting. But he was also a world traveler. He traveled all over the world and wrote these stories for papers about his travels. And he made these comments. He traveled to Utah, for example. There was a book he wrote called Roughing It. If you ever get a chance, it's quite the story. He talks about, he goes here to Utah and he describes the Wasatch Mountains as being as impressive as the Great Wall of China and all sorts of stuff like that. So he was a travel writer too. He was also a comedian. He did stand-up comedy, made a lot of money doing that. He traveled, this is before TV or anything like that. This is go to the theater and buy a ticket to see Mark Twain, tell jokes. But anyway, the point is, he was also a very famous author and writer. And he traveled to India, and he said this: India has 2 million gods and worships them all. In religion, all other countries are paupers. India is the only millionaire. Nobody else has as many gods as India does. And it's got to add to the richness of the culture. I don't know. Now, the 3 key gods are these. Okay, so let's get through the 3 key gods. Brahma, which is the creator, which you've already been introduced to. Shiva is the destroyer. So there's this kind of dualistic nature of it. You got creation and destruction, right? And in a way, they're kind of, aren't they both two sides of the same coin? Can you have creation without destruction? You got to kind of have that. I mean, you think about the folks in Egypt, the same thing, right? You have sun coming up, life, birth, basically, death, travels through the stomach of that one goddess and then comes out. But it's life, death, and rebirth, isn't it? Life, death, and rebirth. Here it's the same sort of thing. And then you got another God who's kind of standing in the middle, Vishnu, who is the preserver. So you have a destroyer and a preserver and a creator. Brahma is thought of as the creator. Vishnu is the sustainer of life. So for the Egyptians, it would be the sustaining of life as it crosses over, right? Or as the Nile floods. And Shiva is associated with dissolution and death. Do things decay? What will happen to this building in 1,000 years? My guess is this building won't be here 50 years before it's going to be torn down and a new building will take its place. 50 years is a long time for a building. But isn't that everything? Look at all the automobiles. Guys in the back, I need you paying attention. I've got to have your attention here. All cars rust, go away. All people eventually die and turn to dust, right? But then what happens? And India has an answer for that. There is, the whole idea of rebirth. So here you have the gods. Now look how elaborately adorned they are. Look at the beauty. Look at the artwork. I mean, they really spared no expense, no effort at trying to make these gods visually stunning. And this is part of the culture. India, the way they dress, it's visually stunning. It really, truly is. Anyway, basically in Hinduism, because it's polytheistic, because it believes in so many gods, there are more approaches to truth than just one, and more ways to salvation than just one. There's many paths. For example, take a mountain. There's many paths up the mountain, right? You're going to hear this concept a lot later when we talk about Buddhism, which hasn't been born yet. Okay, Hinduism is standing alone right now in India. This is a hard concept for adherents of strict monotheistic religions like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. That's not what those religions profess. It's much more of a structured kind of thing. Here, it's less structured. Basically, polytheism's like that. You've got to account for millions of gods. So therefore, there's got to be millions of pathways that person can improve. And I think that's the key thing here. Can any of these paths allow for improvement? So that becomes kind of a big difference between Hinduism and, say, the religions of the West. And we remember we're talking about Western history, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All right, there's lots of festivals. They're all brilliant, they're fun, but this one is particularly fun. And this is, by the way, a picture taken in Utah. It's called the Festival of Colors. It happens every year. This is actually a picture from India, but here's somebody, enjoying the Festival of Colors, which happens all over the place. And because of the diaspora, we've seen this festival practice here in the United States. And this one right here is the Utah, which happens in basically Spanish Fork every year. And it's part of that Indian culture that has moved. How many have ever done this? Did you go to it? Yeah, very cool. Let's go ahead and play this little video, show you what it's like.
Have you ever been to the Festival of Colors?
No, I've been down to that temple down there, but not.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. In this week's Uniquely Utah, Todd Tanner gives us an inside look at the Festival of Colors and why the man who started it all says it's time for the festival to move beyond Utah's borders.
Okay, how cool is that? Basically, you buy these different colors of powder, and then when the signal goes up, everybody throws. My kids used to do this every year, right? They just loved it. And you always take some clothes, like the best is to wear a nice white shirt, white t-shirt, and because it's going to get messy. Do not wear your best clothes here, okay? Go get some hand-me-downs or go buy some older clothes or whatever, from DI, whatever it happens to be, because it's going to be epic. And here you go. Let's watch that one scene again as it starts. Okay, so just this explosion of color. So here are the young kids. There's a lot of young kids out there. Here we go.
Holi, or the Festival of Colors, is a Hare Krishna tradition dating back centuries. But nowhere in the world does the crowd gather to celebrate like they do here in Spanish Fork, Utah.
There are a lot of people here. It's very enjoyable. I mean, it's not just fun, but there's joy in it.
Some come with a purpose,
I like the idea of the joy of the colors is throwing away the worries and celebrating those things.
others come just for fun.
I'm channeling my inner hippie.
A few even come to make magic moments. Scott Christer and Lucy Stott are from Colorado. Marriage will take place in a Mormon temple, but the proposal took place here.
I knew all of her friends were going to be here, and it was going to be just a crazy day, so I knew it would be do it. It's saran wrap.
And no one goes home clean. The colors themselves are just a combination of cornstarch and food dye. But Sharu Das says the color's much more.
The colors come from the emergence of spring after the stark bleakness of winter.
He's the man behind this temple and its famous festival.
The first festival was 4 Indians and 2 BYU students, and it's doubled almost every year since it started.
Most days, the temple only has a trickle of visitors, and it's the peacocks that provide the color on the temple grounds.
And the llamas, they have llamas. It's really, they have in fact, a festival called Llama Fest, which is really kind of cool too.
There's so much more than the temporal, the ephemeral, the passing, that there's so much more to life. Getting your name in the newspaper, getting a bank balance, there's love.
During the Festival of Colors, Sharu Das doesn't miss a chance to send a message to the masses.
Do you have a vision for the future? Are you bouncing out of bed in the morning, looking forward to what the day will offer you? Take it to a higher level, then just chant, hey!
This festival gives people some pointers, some indicators of how to accept that invitation.
An invitation he hopes to help deliver.
I've got a plan, not only to be the person of color in Los Angeles and Salt Lake City and Spanish Fork, but in Denver, in Phoenix, and San Francisco. What do you think about that? Yeah!
It's a precursor of what's awaiting for us in the eternal spiritual world. A little taste to whet our appetite.
There you go. And so that's like I said, it was kind of a fun thing for my kids to go and be involved in. And I don't know, but it's part of this diaspora. Remember we talked about the diaspora? We have a lot of people from India moving to the United States, and they're bringing their festivals with them and their ideas about the world. So that's why we should study it. Okay, so we're going to pause right there. That'll be we'll stop the share here for a second and we'll end this one. But I think it's a pretty